Bonnie. Thank you for coming. Hope you enjoy the weather. Oh my goodness, what a great day. Let's hope it holds on for tomorrow. Just in case you have not gotten your house tour tickets, this is a great time to get your house tour tickets. So today's talk is from Carlton Brose, and my name is Bonnie Isman. I've been asked to do an introduction. Carlton doesn't need an introduction to any of us. However, just to give you a little background on his publishing history, he started out his work as a programmer for IBM until 1971, when he decided to jump ship, as he says, to a fledgling college textbook company, Sinauer Associates. He took on business functions and then the psychology editorship. And after 25 years, he'd fathered some interesting textbooks and even at least one bestseller.
Oh, right.
They moved to Amherst in 1974, met his neighbor, Mike DeShervinen, who was owner of the Amherst Record. And Mike was shepherding an effort to update the town history. Dr. Theodore Green from Amherst College had accepted the challenge of putting together authors of chapters to write a volume that would be entitled Essays on Amherst History. A really fundamental work that you'd be interested in, I'm sure. Mike somehow found a reason to pass the baton to Carlton. And after, as he says, arm-twisting, cajoling, and other non-literary activities, managed to get the publication of the book underway with the help of the authors, the production people, and financial backing from Toby Dakin.
Oh, nice.
And then in 1989, Ted Green agreed that the 250th anniversary of First Church was a reason to publish a history of First Church. A host of volunteers made text available, and Carlton shepherded it into life. And the title of that one is 250 Years at First Church Amherst, 1739 to 1989. And I think copies of that are still available at a modest price. Since then, Carlton has been a principal in the local publishing group called Amherst Area Publications and participated in publishing Harvesting History at Amherst, Massachusetts Farms, 1700 to 2010 with Ruth Jones and Sheila Rainford. So he has a wealth of publishing history and knowledge. Please welcome Carlton Brose.
First, I want to thank the Historical Society and George Norton to be invited to speak about First Church. Thank you all for coming. First Church's history spans 278 years, therefore there are many theological events, pastors, and church actions. This will be about the high and low points of the life of the church and its effect on the town of Amherst. Lots of efforts and emotions have been expended in the life of this congregation in my years as a member. And a reading of our church history book attests to a past of outpouring of love, consternation, caring, disputation, simple faith and hope for and trust in the future, and an overriding commitment to the teachings of the Scriptures. I happen to have a great affection for First Church, this ancient house of God. I've been treasurer and moderator and served on just about every council, board, and ministry since 1974. In this history, I've frequently quoted previous historians and writers and slipped myself into the church's history by adding my 2 cents to the story. I particularly like the early stories as told by Frank Prentice Rand. In 1939, he wrote, this is a document, 200 Years in View and Review, on the church's 200-year celebration. To set the scene, he started speaking of the pontifical Jonathan Edwards, who has been fueling a religious revival, proclaiming the Calvinist doctrine in Northampton. He also remarked that the Indians continued to be a bother in the American colony, and George II is on the throne. Our story begins then in 1735, when Zachariah Field, whose home was just about where the State College's greenhouses were eventually built, invited one Reverend David Parsons Jr., at the age of 23, to hold a family service of worship. Services continued with other neighbors like the Jonathan Coles and Samuel Bolkowitz and other families. After providing Reverend Parsons with lodging for a couple of years, Mr. Coles found that he can now bring himself to charge his hospitality to the community. Therefore, a group of local pioneers, Coleses, Smiths, Kellogg's, a Dickinson, a Mattoon, an Ingram and a Nash put their heads together to offer Reverend Parsons a salary of £40 a year to be their pastor. They did not build him a parsonage, but pledged 100 cords of wood every winter to heat the substantial house he built for himself. He was thus ordained. Oh, this story does not start in Amherst, Massachusetts. Reverend David Parsons was ordained as spiritual leader in the Church of Christ in Hadley, 3rd Precinct. And the date was November 7th, 1739. A mile or so south of the Fields' home, where the Amherst College Octagon building stands, our pious churchman, consuming 77 shillings worth of sugar and rum, built the first meeting house. It is finished in 1753. Why did it take 4 years to put up a church building that would maybe take a week or two to finish? The answer is much disputation around where to place the church so that it is in the center of the community. 6 years after the church is built, the 3rd Precinct becomes the District of Amherst. The world is not standing still for this tiny district. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty, in defiance of the Tea Act of May 10, 1773, destroyed an entire shipment of tea sent by the East India Company. The next year, the First Continental Congress is answering the call for rebellion. In the First Congregational Church, friction has been developing between Tory parishioners loyal to the king and those in favor of revolution. To make things worse, the Reverend Parsons was a staunch Tory, and some members of the church were asking for his resignation. In 1775, there were several attempts to form a committee. To form a committee, we'll repeat. To talk with the Reverend Parsons, all of which failed. Finally, in 1777, the town voted that the conduct of the Reverend Parsons is not friendly with regard to the common cause. The war had come closer, but the Reverend Parsons continued to preach to his mixed congregation of Whigs and Tories. However, from the pulpit he was obliged to read a proclamation issued by the rebel government, which he did. The notice ended with, "God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts." And Parsons added, "But I say, God save the King." Young Nat Dickinson jumped up and shouted in tones that echoed through the hushed congregation, "And I say you're a damned rascal." Thereupon Dickinson stomped out. Parsons wrote his will on Christmas Day, 1780, and he died a week later. After having temporary preachers fill the pulpits briefly, the church voted with much angst and the slender majority to replace him with his son, David Parsons, also a staunch conservative. With the church members split, there was much talk about forming a second parish to be situated near the East Amherst Common. Finally, those favoring revolution sent a letter to the Honorable Senate and House of Representatives of Massachusetts in General Court in 1783, which asked permission to form their own church and ordain a preacher. 22 revolutionaries from First Church moved to Second Church. Turmoil ensued because First Church had been the center of the parish being supported by town taxes. For a while, in 1788, there were attempts to draw Second Church back into the fold by offering full membership in First. One might suggest this might have been more than an effort of reconciliation, since the split ended the community monetary support. But all attempts failed. In 1812, Noah Webster and his family came to Amherst and quickly joined the church and were active in it for 10 years. By 1819, at a parish meeting with Noah Webster presiding moderator, it was voted to appoint a committee to confer with Reverend David Parsons, the son, about his dismissal. The meeting was conducted prayerfully and deliberately, giving full weight to the rights of the Reverend Pastor and present and future welfare of the church. The Parsons' time in the pulpit of First Church father and son lasted 80 years and had come to a close. In the founding of Amherst College in 1815, the minister and members of this church took the lead. They bore the burden, they did the work, and they gave the money. Elijah Dickinson gave the land. David Parsons gave substantial funds for buildings. As the first president of the Board of Trustees, he performed the laying of the college cornerstone. Noah Webster, the next president of the board, gave the ceremonial address. In 1826, we decided to sell the pews to raise money for operating expenses. However, the church on the hill, which now has a steeple and a revere bell, the conch shell is no longer needed to call the faithful. Conch shell. The church is too small for the growing numbers of parishioners, and there is a need for a new church. 2 years later, a plan for a new building is approved. Amherst College offered a plot of land on the northeast corner of a farm formerly owned by the heirs of Reverend Dr. Parsons. In return, the congregation agreed to take down and remove their present building on the hill. The sale of pews netted $6,600, and Amherst College gave $700. The building, the First Church edifice, was built in time for the college commencement of 1829. It stands on the corner of Route 9 and South Pleasant Street and is known as College Hall. Talk was in the air in 1865 about either fixing up the existing church or building a new one, with committees being formed and, most of all, indecision reigned. The church was wrestling with reorganization of the Sabbath school, hiring a new pastor, worrying about that the Benevolent Society was not giving enough money, reopening the issue of not charging enough for pew rental. But they finally voted to sell the meeting house, lecture room, land, and the old parsonage to pay debts and start paying on building a new church. A Montague lot of 1.8 acres was purchased for $3,900, and Mr. C.W. Lessie's bid of $38,950 was the lowest to erect the stone structure. The cornerstone of the fourth meeting house of the First Congregational Society of Amherst was laid September 21st, 1867, 150 years ago. We must say something about Emily Dickinson. Apparently it was recorded that as a small child she was taken to First Church. However, the stone building on Main Street across from the homestead never saw her shadow. She was the church's most famous non-member. The annual meeting of 1888 culminated in a drastic change in church polity. It was voted that all members of the church not under 18 years old are entitled to vote. This effectively gave women of the parish the right to vote. Something new. How did this happen? From what I see recorded, there was a substantial mortgage on the new stone church, and the parish was finding that money mattered. Although women could not vote before, the Ladies' Benevolent Society was invited to choose 2 of their number to act with the male parish committee. The clerk was ordered to thank the Ladies' Benevolent Society for carpeting and upholstering the new church, as well as contributions of money toward the building of the church, for the gift of handsome communion and pulpit tables, for Bible and hymn books, etc. I think the point is that the ladies had a lot of money and were very active in the church. It was then that cedar from Mount Lebanon and olive wood were supplied by the Reverend Daniel Bliss for the construction of a pulpit. The wood was trimmed and dragged by camel to Beirut, Lebanon, and shipped to Boston. The Sweetser family footed the bill to make the pulpit. This pulpit was removed in the early 1960s. I'm remembering that early on, I was told that the cedars of Lebanon wood was disintegrating, and church members made crosses from the good slivers and sold them at a church fair. Back to 1889, the church voted to appoint a 150th anniversary committee for the first time. The church records included reports on church societies, including the Ladies' Benevolent Society, the Women's Foreign Mission Society, the Women's Home Mission Society, and the Young Ladies Missionary Society. All societies were active in important work at the church. In 1893, there were disciplinary actions taken by the church that withdrew membership and placed on probation fellows on account of fraud, drunkenness, stealing from an employer, and undoubtedly resulted in embarrassment, which in several cases were recorded, resulted only in repeated behavior. The parish system ended in 1904, when at an annual meeting, the church voted on incorporation. The certificate of incorporation started off, "We, William A. Burnett, George Cutler, D.B. Elder, C.S. Walker, C. Wellington, C.R. Elder, being a majority of the Board of Trustees, certify said church was duly organized into a corporation. The name of the corporation is the First Congregational Church in Amherst. The purpose for which the corporation is constituted is the establishment and maintenance of the public worship of God in accordance with the principles and doctrines of the Trinitarian Congregational churches." A Trinitarian believes that God embodies Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the Trinity. The church records from this time forward, I just wanted to mention, one of the names was C.R. Elder. C.R. Elder built the house we live in on Triangle Street. The church records from this time forward showed that a new era had dawned. Every member canvass was a new idea. Also, there was a lighthearted service of recognition of a new pastor, John A. Hawley, for pastorate of the church in 1913. There were toasts, a minister's quartet, and a talk by Reverend Hawley on new ideals of cooperation. Some of the parishioners may have smiled in approval. Later, the young people were permitted to construct and use a tennis court on the church's lot. I must now leap over the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. Call it a leap of faith. Which comes down on changes that seriously affected First Church. Here's a minor note. In May of 1945, when she was 10 years old, Gloria Steinem was baptized in First Church. When she was here with her mother visiting her sister at Smith College. I should mention that after the Second World War and the post-war boom, all America was changing In Amherst in 1953, the Reverend Thayer Green and his wife Anita came to First Church. And during their pastorate, First Church attendance and involvement shot up, and a new theology was emerging. Reverend Green introduced thoughts from the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, which delved deep into the human psyche. The Greens became Jungian psychologists after leaving the pastorate in the late 1950s, but the direction persisted and flourished during the 1960s and 1970s. The December 1, 1955 bus riding event in Montgomery, Alabama involving Rosa Parks was followed in 1957 with the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference by Martin Luther King. In the face of wholesale civil rights violations, churches searched their souls and came up wanting. A new age was dawning when social issues would come to the fore, led by pastors like King, who came to First Church on April 17, 1961, and spoke in the church's dining room. A few years later, both pastors of First Church went south to march with Martin Luther King. This did not go well at First Church, and conservative members moved on to other churches. The women's movement was embraced in 1966. We elected our first woman deacon, our first woman moderator, Gail McClung, in 1972, and in 1980 called our first woman pastor, Reverend Dr. Donna Scupper. Outreach into the town and beyond became the foundation of ministries throughout the church. In 1970s, the church housed a food co-op in its downstairs dining room and a furniture exchange. In 1982, a soup kitchen was proposed and the ruling council approved, and shortly it was running fully staffed. This has evolved into Not Bread Alone, serving anyone who is hungry 3 times a week. Our members were among the founders of A Better Chance program, which it continues to support. Before the 1970s were over, we developed an emergency housing program, Gene Elder Housing, and sponsored a Cambodian refugee family. In the mid-1970s, Pastor Chuck Farrell and his wife decided that the parsonage was too large for just 2 of them, and we were therefore convinced the congregation to rent it to community homes for children. Since then, the former parsonage has been Grace House and is now Jesse's House, both operations of the Center for Human Development. What started as a first congregational preschool has become the Spring Street Preschool, which is housed in the space the congregation built in the 1950s. There were hundreds of children in the preschool and church school at that time. The annual First Church Cranberry Fair started in 1980. It's known far and wide among some antique dealers, but mostly among Christmas shoppers, Christmas gift shoppers. This is a day that several other churches are having gift fairs, and some because First Church did it first. The list of purchasing opportunities at First Church is vast. Our entire church is involved at one table or another, and we use every room and floor space available except for the pastor's offices. Mostly we have fun meeting friends in the town and loving the many people that inhabit our church for 6 hours on Saturday in November. Imagine a church that's put aside the seemingly endless round of meetings that discuss everything from the budget to the sermons, from the parking lot to the fundraisers, from the heating in the sanctuary to the lighting in the narthex. Well, once a year, First Church becomes totally organized around a night of frivolity. It is called the Merry Musical and dates back to the 1960s. Members and friends gather in a decorated dining room for a potluck supper at long tables, sing a blessing for the food, eat, and face the stage where all of our talented members and some not so talented perform in a variety show that goes from laughs to sentimental oohs and ahas, and to musical numbers and puppets and jokes. A sample: people are funny, they want the front of the bus, the middle of the road, and the back of the church. Have we been involved in the town? Yes. When the town fair was more of a local affair, we had a sandwich and lemonade booth for years. Lynn Van Deen of First Church led the International Sunday Committee, which was held at First Church. Then there is the ecumenical Thanksgiving service, and at this time we have Music on Main, which presents special music for me. First Church resolutely followed its recent turn to social issues under the leadership of Pastor Jeanette Good in 1987, when the congregation voted to become open and affirming. And a Just Peace Church same year. And in 2003, we became an Earth Covenant congregation. In 2010, we voted a proactive anti-racism commitment, and in 2017, we became an immigrant welcoming congregation. First Church has, in the last 2 weeks, taken on the awesome task of caring for a young man who is on the verge of being unwillingly separated from his family for the first time in 20 years. No matter what the opinion of the outer world, no matter how the sanctuary of Mr. Perez turns out, this story will undoubtedly appear in our future history book under the date October 19th, 2017. Thank you for listening. Excuse me, yes?
Questions?
Sure.
You mentioned a number of distinguished people who have appeared at the church. Another one is Frederick Douglass. In May 1865, which is just 1 month after Lincoln was killed, he gave a speech in version 3 of the First Church, what is now Amherst College's College Hall.
Yes.
And I've speculated about that speech. How could he have given a talk there and not said something about Abraham Lincoln? But I don't know of any record of what he talked about.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yes, the name Strong also is I saw in the documentation that I was reading. Stronghouse, yes.
One little side note that you didn't mention regarding the Dickinsons, I believe that Emily's brother Austin was chair of the building committee in 1867 that built the current church.
Yes. Yeah, I should have put that in.
I don't know, some stuff.